They say moving into a new home should be exciting, but the moment I unpacked my boxes, the HOA stormed in like they owned the place. Their demand? Not my fence, not my lawn. They wanted my entire lake, as if I was just some intruder trespassing on their rules. What they didn't realize was that the very docks they strutted across, the ones they thought gave them power, were mine to control. And when they pushed too far, I had a choice: surrender or show them just how deep the water ran. So, what would you have done in my place? When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found a perfect place to start fresh. The house wasn't the biggest, but it was surrounded by something far more valuable: peace. Out back stretched a wide, quiet lake where the sunrise painted the water gold each morning. It felt like my own private escape, a place where I could breathe, think, and finally settle into a slower rhythm of life. The neighbors seemed polite enough at first glance, the kind who waved when you drove by, but never lingered long enough for a real conversation. For the first few days, everything felt normal, almost too normal. Families went about their routines, kids played along the streets, and joggers circled the lake trail like clockwork. It was the kind of orderly community you'd expect to be tightly managed, though I hadn't yet seen just how tightly. There was no noise, no clutter, not a blade of grass out of place. At first, I thought it was charming until I noticed how often people glanced toward my property, whispering as they passed. The lake, I would later learn, wasn't just a pretty view to them. It was a symbol of control, a centerpiece for the community, complete with private docks that residents had grown used to treating as their own. But on paper, in black and white, that lake belonged to me. The docks? They rested on my land. And while I was content to share, I hadn't realized that the HOA wasn't. They weren't satisfied with order. They demanded ownership. And it wouldn't take long before they came knocking, ready to turn my new home into a battlefield. At first, the HOA's presence in my life seemed like background noise, distant, almost harmless. I'd see their board members walking together in small groups, pointing at properties and scribbling on clipboards. Sometimes they'd pause at the edge of my lot, their eyes fixed on the lake behind my house. They never came to the door, not yet, but it was impossible to ignore the way they whispered among themselves before moving on. It felt like they were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came sooner than I expected. Less than 2 weeks after I moved in, a letter arrived. It wasn't a friendly welcome or a packet of neighborhood resources. It was a notice bold, cold, and commanding. According to the HOA, my backyard lake was considered a community resource that needed to be managed for the benefit of all residents. They demanded access, not just for walking trails or scenic views, but for the docks themselves, which they insisted were extensions of neighborhood property. The implication was clear. They believed the lake wasn't mine, even though my deed said otherwise. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was a mistake. But then came the second letter, and the third. Each one grew harsher, dripping with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. They cited obscure bylaws, claimed I was obligated to submit to their authority, and even warned that noncompliance could result in fines. Imagine moving into your dream home, and within days being told by a group of strangers that the most valuable part of your property doesn't belong to you. Then the harassment began. It started small. Neighbors I'd never spoken to suddenly acting cold, refusing to return a wave or muttering under their breath as they passed. Joggers stopped lingering near the lake and instead pointed at it, as though it were a prize the HOA had promised them. One morning, I found a laminated sign staked near the water. HOA property, members only. They had trespassed onto my land to plant their claim. That was the first time I felt true anger stirring inside me. I confronted them in writing, sending a copy of my deed to the board. I made it clear that the lake and docks were mine. Their response was chilling. A letter declaring that my refusal to comply would result in escalating fines. They weren't asking anymore. They were asserting dominance. And true to their word, the fines started rolling in. It began with $50 for unauthorized structures. The so-called structures were my docks, built long before I arrived. Then came $100 for failure to provide access to communal space. A week later, Another $150 for obstruction of HOA amenities. The charges piled up like falling bricks, each one heavier than the last. Within a month, they claimed I owed nearly $1,000. Not because I had broken any laws, but because I had dared to stand my ground. But the fines were only half the battle. The HOA board members made it their mission to hound me at every turn. They'd show up unannounced, snapping photos of my backyard as if gathering evidence for a trial. At community events, I'd hear whispers. That's the guy with the lake. He thinks he's better than us. Neighbors who once smiled at me now crossed the street to avoid me. The isolation was suffocating. And yet, the more they pushed, the more I began to notice something strange. For all their bluster, they seemed almost desperate. They weren't just enforcing rules for the sake of order. They were clinging to something. The lake wasn't just water to them. It was leverage, control, status. Without it, their authority looked fragile. And the harder they tried to take it, the more cracks I saw in their confidence. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when I woke to find a group of board members standing on my dock. They weren't fishing or enjoying the view. They were measuring. Clipboards in hand, tape stretched across the planks. They scribbled notes like surveyors preparing for construction. When I demanded to know what they were doing, one of them coolly replied, just ensuring compliance with HOA standards. Compliance on my dock, on my property. That was the moment the fight turned personal. From then on, every day felt like a siege. Letters turned into threats of liens. Fines multipliées. Rumors spread that I was selfish, uncooperative, even dangerous. A neighbor casually mentioned that the HOA was considering legal action to seize access rights. They spoke as if victory was inevitable, as if my resistance was nothing more than a nuisance delaying the outcome. But what they didn't realize was that I had been digging, quietly gathering every document, every deed, every survey that proved the truth. And with each passing day, their arrogance only fueled my resolve. The tension reached its peak when the HOA called a community meeting. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, announcing an open discussion about the lake situation. I wasn't invited, at least not formally. But I showed up anyway, standing in the back of the crowded clubhouse as board members spoke with polished voices about protecting shared spaces and holding homeowners accountable. Then, almost ceremoniously, they pointed to me. "We have a resident who refuses to comply," the president declared, his words dripping with contempt. The room turned, dozens of eyes staring, waiting for me to defend myself. I could have argued then and there, shouted about property rights, and waved my deed for all to see. But I didn't. I stayed silent, watching, listening. Because while they thought they were putting me on trial, I knew something they didn't. Every dock, every walkway, every inch of lakefront access they depended on legally belonged to me. And when the moment came, I was going to prove it in a way they would never forget. The rising pressure was unbearable. Every letter felt like a warning shot. Every fine, a declaration of war. Yet behind my frustration, there was a flicker of something else. Anticipation. They thought they were tightening the noose, but in reality, they were walking straight into their own trap. And when the rope finally snapped, it wouldn't be around my neck, it would be around theirs. The HOA thought they had cornered me. For weeks, they stacked fine after fine, each one a fresh insult stuffed into my mailbox. They whispered about liens, about seizing property, about dragging me into court until I broke. And when they called their final meeting, I knew this was the moment they had been building toward. They wanted a spectacle, a stage to showcase their power. What they didn't realize was that I was more than ready for it. The clubhouse was overflowing the night of the meeting. Residents packed shoulder to shoulder, some curious, others eager for a show. At the front sat the board, smug in their authority, with the president seated like a judge awaiting his gavel. He wasted no time. The second the murmurs quieted, he declared, "We are here to address ongoing violations by the owner of the lake property. Despite repeated notices, fines, and community votes, this homeowner refuses to comply. Tonight, we decide how to move forward." Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers turned into sharp mutters. It was clear the board expected applause, support, compliance. But as the tension thickened, I stood. For the first time, all eyes were on me. Not as a roomer, not as an outsider, but as the accused. My heart pounded, but I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I pulled a folder from under my arm and let the silence settle before speaking. You've all been told this lake belongs to the HOA, that the docks are community property, that I'm some selfish neighbor standing in the way of your enjoyment. I paused, watching their expectant faces lean forward. Then I opened the folder. But here's the truth. One by one, I laid out the documents. The deed to my property, the survey maps outlining the exact boundaries of the land, the paperwork from the county confirming the lake, and every dock fell under my ownership. With each page I set down, the board's faces darkened. Their smirks faltered. Their confidence cracked. Every fine you've issued, I continued, voice sharpening, has no legal basis. Every threat you've made is harassment. And every neighbor you've turned against me has been manipulated by lies. Because while you've been pretending to enforce rules, I've been documenting everything.